Do you have a one-way video interview coming up and you are scouring the internet for tips and tricks? Well, this is the right video for you. In this video, I'm going to talk about 5 unique tips that you might not have considered before filming your video interview.
This Psychology Month, we're talking about women in science. And on this podcast, we talk about science a lot. One of the things we try to do regularly is something called knowledge translation or knowledge mobilization. And that means we try to take the findings of a research project, for example, and then present them in a way that everyone can understand it. It's especially helpful for me because when I read a research article in the Canadian Journal of Behavioral Science, I'm unlikely to understand 80% of it. I need someone to explain it to me, and I hope that in doing so, they're explaining it to others as well. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the Communications Specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. Our guest today is a Ph.D. student at the University of Calgary. She's been earning accolades for her ability in knowledge translation. She's created a YouTube channel to share the results of her research and provide advice to job seekers who are being asked to do one-way video interviews. Her advice is helpful, and she's doing a tremendous job in ensuring that the science she does impacts the people it's designed to help.
I am Madeline Springle. I'm a second-year PhD student in industrial organizational psychology in the workplace, essentially. And I research a couple of things, mainly in the world of interviews. I focused for my master's on asynchronous video interviews, one-way video interviews, no one's behind the camera. And then my PhD dissertation is focused more on defensive impression management in interviews. So that's answering questions like, what's your greatest weakness? Why do you have a career gap on your resume? And trying to understand how should job applicants actually respond to those types of questions in interviews. And we don't know a lot about that.
Right. There's a lot, I think, that we don't know about interviews now. And especially, the job application process, now that there's so much AI involved in it, it's sort of difficult, I think, for people to try to figure out, how do I tailor my resume? How do I tailor a cover letter? How do I respond in a video situation? And you've won some awards for knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, which is translating the research you're doing for a general public audience. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've really been enjoying throughout grad school of taking the research that we do and thinking about who is actually impacted by this. So specifically with asynchronous video interviews, I'll spend time kind of scrolling on Reddit, and what you see on there it makes me sad because it's people that are so stressed, they're so anxious with, we call them ABIs for short, but they just they're anxiety inducing, and people don't know best practices for what to do for that. So one of my kind of goals was to share a bit about my master's research specifically. So we have this competition called the Shirk Storytellers Competition, and this is Canada-wide, and you submit a 3-minute video of your Shirk-funded project. And it's neat. It's across all different disciplines, even outside psychology. And so
sorry, just before you continue, what is Shirk?
Absolutely. Yeah. So kind of stepping back a little bit, it's the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And so they fund a lot of research projects. So what's important is really it's taxpayers are paying for this research, and we want to make sure that the actual research findings is coming back to them full circle.
Right. And so you get the money to do that. You've created this research, and then there's this competition. You submit a 3-minute video, also a one-way video, as it were. So tell me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. City of Calgary, where I am, we have a lot of resources to help you with this video. So, for example, I went to the library and rented a podcast mic, kind of soundproof studio, and did the voiceover there. And then I learned about different kind of free media options that are out there to actually design the video. So it's really tough to condense your 2-year master's into just 3 minutes, but such a good experience to think of how can I make this video interesting? I have zero experience with designing kind of that kind of media. So it was a pretty new techniques everywhere. So basically, everyone creates a 3-minute video, and it's designed to be very general in the sense of anyone on YouTube could watch it, understand what your research was about, what are the key takeaways, what did you find, and how does this impact the average Canadian? So from there, it's really interesting because the next phase is actually taking that 3-minute video. So the top 20 winners then present live in a 3-minute thesis style competition. So what that basically means is instead of having the video being the main piece, you standing on the stage speaking to an audience about your research is the next round. And yeah, it was hard, I will say.
Is that hard because you're not familiar with public speaking? I mean, are you taking basically what was in the video and then making that directly your 3-minute speech? How does that work?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's hard because the video has so many things to make it eye-catching, make it interesting, and then all of a sudden it's just you talking. So I pretty much took my video script, like the voiceover, and used almost all of that as the format and the layout of my script. So, and that's what a lot of people do too, because it's kind of the root of what you want to do. But when I was working through my script, it was neat because I had support from the knowledge mobilization team at the University of Calgary. And they were like, think about the person who is sitting in the audience. What are they thinking when they're listening to your speech? How is an AVI impacting them? And so that was helpful because I think a lot of the time too, we just think of this general audience of people out there who are maybe watching our video or listening to our speech, but thinking specifically with the individual person was really helpful for catering the speech. So there's also, it's kind of in line with the 3-minute thesis competition, which is all across the world for all graduate students. Mm-hmm. And so what that involves is basically the same format, speaking for 3 minutes on your research to a general audience. So it's the exact same style. It's just that for the Shirk Storytellers live version, we had multiple slides that we could work through. Whereas with the 3-minute thesis, you only have one slide.
Right. And I imagine that it's kind of the difference, right, between creating a YouTube series, which you have created, and we'll get into that in a minute, and doing a TED Talk, right, where it's just you're on the stage, you're going to videotape it, you're going to disseminate it, people are going to watch it. And I think that a lot of the time, the people I've spoken to with who've done TED Talks or who are a little, curious about how that works and that is that they have a hard time imagining who the audience is going to be. So for you, one-way video interviews, who is the audience? Who is going to pay attention to that? Who cares about it and is interested?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think that's what job candidates struggle with the most with these AVIs is it's nerve-wracking to think that it could be AI evaluating it. We like it depends. We don't know. Sometimes that it might be the case, but also are you speaking to one person? Are you speaking to a panel of audiences? Are you speaking to someone in the organization versus someone who's been hired to evaluate this? So one of the things that I kind of recommend people do is print out a picture of someone who works in HR, like a stock photo, put it behind the camera and just pretend that you're talking to that person. I think that's helpful for like you said, like talking to the individual and having that frame of reference in mind.
I love the idea of talking to a stock photo of someone who works in HR. I want to know what that looks like. What does your stock photo of someone who works in HR look like? I know. But even just or a friend, I also recommend that too. It's like print a photo of a friend that maybe you've practiced your interview questions with and have that familiar face of the person behind the camera. So I'm not familiar with this one-way video idea. AFI, I think you're calling it?
AVI, yeah.
So, yes. I'm not familiar with this. I've never done that before. What kind of jobs are asking people to do a one-way video where presumably, I guess they send you the question, then you read the question and you answer it in video form, and then you send them the video. Who's asking for that? In what circumstance does that take place?
Yeah, absolutely. So asynchronous video interviews or AVIs, they have taken off a lot during the pandemic because it made hiring easier with not having to be in person, et cetera. Usually it's the first line of interviews. And it's kind of that filtering process where you've seen people's resumes, you send them a link to complete an AVI. They might have a couple of questions. It depends. Sometimes there's quite a few, but let's just say like 4 to 5 questions. You've got maybe 2 minutes to answer each question. And it's to get a sense of like, are you a real person? Can you speak to some of these things? Typically a bit more general questions, I might say. But in terms of industries, it's pretty widespread. So it might be common for very large organizations, especially if they have a lot of candidates coming in. Engineering roles, a lot of med school applications will now have that. I know one chiropractic also has that for graduate school level admissions. So they vary a lot. Typically, it wouldn't be used for smaller organizations because the goal is just to reduce the job candidate, and as well, like you're typically paying for a service there. So, for example, like HireVue is one of the big asynchronous video interview companies. Or also, like pilots in aviation, they might do a one-way video interview. So it really varies across the board, but it's not specific to one niche, let's say.
Right. And we've talked a lot in the last few years, certainly with Zoom interviews being, now very popular. I mean, we're doing a Zoom interview right now.
We are.
After all, and hiring practices, trying to increase the level of diversity in companies, but also trying to take away the bias that's inherent in the interview process. And I wonder if you've looked into any of this with the AVI process, whether or not that does remove some of the bias or whether maybe it adds some of it back in.
Yeah, it's really tough because we're doing lots of research now in this field on these topics, but I can speak specifically to my master's thesis, which was looking at socioeconomic status as a background cue and whether that affects the evaluator's perception of the candidate. And so what we found really interestingly was that, so for example, I used a green screen and had the same job candidate complete the same AVI, but I just switched out the background to have a low socioeconomic status background in one AVI and then a high SES background.
What does it look like if my background it shows that I have a low socioeconomic status? What does my background look like?
We pilot tested different images and I just found one that conveyed like really kind of dim lighting, maybe like a cheap kind of ratty couch. The place didn't look really nice. And it had kind of a couch in the background, kind of gray and brown decor, let's say. And then the high SES video, though, it was interesting because it had a nice couch in the background, similar layout. It was also gray, but it was just modern, chic, pretty bougie. I think there was a chandelier in there. So we had participants online actually rate the SES of the two different images to get a sense of, okay, this is actually rated as a lower SES compared to this one.
Okay. So, yeah. I mean, nothing says bougie to me like having a chandelier in your house.
Totally.
Yeah, that definitely seems bougie. And so what were the results? Like, did the people with the lower socioeconomic Zoom background fare worse in interviews?
Well, that's what's really, really interesting is they actually didn't. But what we found were some interesting correlation patterns that were in the data that shouldn't have been there if there was no difference between the two images. And so what I mean by that is the actual evaluator's own SES. So let's say if I'm evaluating the AVI, my SES was correlated with how I rated the candidate and how I viewed the SES of their background. And kind of like taking a step back, what we know with AVI evaluations is that the evaluator themselves and who they are, characteristics about themselves, can impact the actual ratings that they give the candidate. And we know that from other research in AVIs, like one's political status, parental status, like those kind of things. And so I don't want to say it's a good news story because there's more to it, but the ratings themselves weren't different. What the evaluator's own SES was impacted how they rated the candidate, which isn't good. That's not a good sign.
Yeah, I see what you mean. if you're advising somebody, you've created a YouTube channel now where you're
Yeah.
dispensing some of the advice that you have gleaned over the time of doing this research, which I think is really interesting. And
Thank you.
I watched some of the videos, but having not gone through this AVI process myself, I'm not super familiar with the process. But what is some of the advice you're giving out? Let's start with what should your background look like if you're going to be doing an AVI, and how do you set that up?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the YouTube channel, I was keen to just kind of take the research that we know and bring it to people who are actually doing the AVIs and who need some help. So that was my goal in that, of bridging that gap. And in terms of people's background, I'd say there's the part of the problem is there's no clear answer as to what people should be putting in their background. So for example, we're not certain what the like whether a blurred background is the answer. We don't really know. Like maybe that affects people's trust levels. Am I hiding something in my background? What we do kind of know though is there shouldn't be any red flags in the background. So you don't want something that's going to be immediately no. So and I think a good rule of thumb is like if you're not really sure, might be a good idea just to remove it. We know one of the problems with AVIs is they expose personal information that wouldn't be available with an in-person interview. And I think what's key is for people just to assess their background before they start filming their asynchronous video interview and just think, okay, there we go. Now I can see everything in your background.
Right?
Nice. Are you in your kitchen? I love that.
Well, I'm in my living room, but I have all my
Okay.
kitchen stuff behind me. Up until now, I've had my virtual background on.
Yes.
And you have a blurred background, which
I
makes
know.
me suspicious of you. I feel
I
like,
know. I feel like a hypocrite. How do you even get rid of your blurred background? Okay, there we go. I have nothing to hide, but I just feel like it's my calendar and that's not really exciting. So, yeah,
like,
basically when it
I
comes to
feel like if
yeah,
you have a calendar in your background, you need to put little like push pins and strings on it so it looks like you're solving a murder at all times. You know what I mean?
that will definitely get you hired, I think, for sure.
Yes, attention to detail is very important in many jobs. And
Yeah.
I'm throwing this on now because I have been instructed to put a fake background on, because this is very, my background has all my kitchen implements behind me. I have a stand mixer and paper towels
I
and
see that.
slow cooker and so on, and my spice rack.
Yeah.
So it's very distracting, I think, to people is the idea. But
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. It's like you don't want your background to be distracting for the person evaluating it at all. But one thing to kind of note is that it's interesting with these AVI platforms is sometimes we can't actually control like the Zoom or the virtual background. Like it's not a Zoom situation where you can just change the background. Sometimes what you have is what's there. So I feel like people don't know that going in ahead of time.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if too many people are technologically capable enough. I'm sure I'm not, to put a background filter on
Right.
a video that you're doing. Right.
Yeah.
And I think also a lot of people know only how to do it from their phone, which would make it a
Yes.
little bit more difficult too, right? Framing it properly and so on.
Yeah, and that's actually another great point is that a lot of the times these AVIs are filmed from their phone. Like they're meant to be convenient and like a little bit quicker and more accessible too. Like sometimes not everyone will have a laptop, right? So that's another key piece. And really I think it's about like taking the time to make sure you're setting it up. There's not a lot of background noise that's going to be distracting. You can see your face, those kind of things where I don't know if everyone is doing that maybe or thinking about those things beforehand. So that's kind of one of the things maybe I talk about in the YouTube channel is just thinking about that. And I think one of my favorite videos is to record or re-record. That is the question. And it's interesting with AVIs, it depends on what the company chooses to, I guess, allow job applicants to do. So for example, sometimes you can re-record your responses to an unlimited amount of times. Sometimes you might have 5 attempts. Sometimes this is just a one and done. And so people might think like, oh, an unlimited amount of times is amazing, but like that's tiring for people to have to say you re-record each answer 10 times. that's pretty exhausting. That might make it feel pretty scripted. Is it really you on the 10th time? So,
Right.
yeah.
Yes, I find the same thing when I'm doing the podcast here. I'll do the interview and then I'll record an intro and then I'll record an outro.
Mhm.
And I find I'll write it out sort of and have a general idea of where I'm going. And I'll go through it once and I'll usually stumble on a word here or there and I'll re-record it a second time because then I
Yeah.
know exactly what I want to say. It's in my head and it usually comes out pretty well. But yeah, if I get to the fourth, fifth, sixth time, then I no longer even feel like myself when I'm doing it. I feel like right? So
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's
get
a
where that.
great example. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And especially too, like with the job applicant, just the nerves and the anxiety that can come with interviews. I think it's probably I'm assuming it's common to want to re-record something if, like you said, you kind of mess up a little bit and it's like, oh, I'm gonna make it perfect. But yeah, there's the pros and cons we got to weigh and really think about before whether deciding something is worth re-recording.
And so that's one of the videos that you have on the YouTube channel. You
Mhm.
discuss the pros and cons of re-recording and how many times to do it. How did this video channel come up? Like, what made you think, oh, I could just do a series of YouTube videos to help people with this very specific thing that a lot of people really need help with? What was the idea there? Did this come from the 3-minute video you submitted for the competition?
Yeah, I think it's kind of built out of a couple of things. In industrial organizational psychology, I would say our field is really trying to bridge what we call that scientist practitioner gap. And so this was something that seemed like a really feasible solution. It was nerve-wracking, I will say. Like it's tough to talk to the
Yeah.
camera and not have anyone there, ironically, which is what AVIs are all about. But yeah, and I think something that has really just helped, keep the motivation going for grad school is doing fun projects like this that this is what we cover in grad school. It's research, it's based on what we've learned, but it's kind of you're learning new skills, you're putting yourself outside your comfort zone. And yeah, it was something new that I wanted to try and it took off. Not it didn't take off. It's taking off. It's in the process.
Where are you in the trajectory of taking off right now with the YouTube channel?
I feel like it's subjective. I will say though, I think I found a secret. So I'll go on Reddit and type in asynchronous video interviews, kind of read some questions that people might have. So someone might ask, why do they insist on using one-way video interviews? So I made a video about that, posted the link there, and I think that's helpful. Or I'll just say like, hey, listen, like these are some reasons why companies are using AVIs. And I think like having that traffic come from there has helped a lot. I've noticed on the YouTube back end. So it's something I'd like to keep doing. And it's great for getting video ideas as well in terms of what questions do people actually have.
I mean, I'm thinking, you do these videos, you're talking to nobody, it's very similar to the actual process of the AVI, right? But you also have a comfortability with it. And I wonder if just having that format for an interview in the first place, when a company decides to do it, you send us a video, if they're really excluding people who have serious anxiety about it. I mean, you mentioned that you were anxious about starting that, just even doing it, right?
Totally.
There is a little bit of a trepidation going into it. Like, am I going to look okay? Am I going to sound okay? Is this going to resonate with people?
Yeah.
And do you think that it's a barrier for a lot of people who just won't and can't wrap their
Yeah.
heads around doing that?
Yeah, I definitely think that probably is likely the case. Unfortunately, I think I've seen different posts online of people saying like, if I get offered to do an AVI, I immediately say no. And I think it's tough because I understand why people might be apprehensive, but at the same time, I think people are missing maybe some of the reasons why AVIs are useful, why companies are using them, and some of the benefits of that. Because, for example, like one of the benefits with the AVIs is it's standardized responses. So everyone's getting the same amount of questions, the same response length. It's really, on the one hand, increasing the fairness of interviews as a whole. It's pretty structured. But going back to what you're saying as well is, like, for example, personality might influence whether people do well or not. And like you could kind of see introverts maybe struggling with AVIs a lot more than extroverts. And is that impacting their ability to get the job? And should it even be related if you have a job where you don't actually see a lot of people during the day?
Yeah, I think my assumption is that AVIs are being asked for from companies where they will be seeing people all day, every
Yeah.
day, where they're going to be interacting with others on a regular basis, and so that they have some sense of how a person might do that. Would
Yeah.
that be an accurate assumption, or is it a little more of a
Yeah.
blanket thing?
I'd say it definitely is the case that that is being used for, I've seen, like, for example, Best Buy, Target in the US being used for those more sales roles, but also we know that they're often used for engineering roles or even to get into engineering, like university engineering programs. And so one could argue maybe they're not talking to people as the main role of their job necessarily.
It's one of those things where, now it's such a regular part of life. It's obviously happening all over the place where, maybe I'm an old person. I know I'm an old person, and I'm stuck in this idea of, like, if you're submitting a video answer to something or a video resume, you're applying for the Bachelorette Canada, right? You're applying to be on a reality show of some kind, and that's what
Yeah.
they want. They want to see your personality when you put your video in, so you do something crazy or whatever, right? Like, that's
Yeah.
still what I'm thinking of when I think video interviews to this day.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think this brings up another good point too. It's like, is this negatively impacting people of different ages too? And furthermore, like let's say if there is the assumption that young people should be good at AVIs and they're not, like maybe they're struggling with the technology component of that, are they being unfairly assessed because of their inability to record the video properly, let's say? And again, it all comes down to, like with interviews, we want to make sure that people are assessed, or that evaluators are assessing job related skills and what is the impact if there's other factors that are playing a role here that aren't actually related to one's ability to do the job.
Now, in the interview process, I'm guessing that the way it normally works is you submit a resume, they filter that out somehow, then they ask the people whose resumes have gone to the top to submit an AVI. You do that, and then the people who they choose from that pile will get an in-person or a virtual, maybe Zoom interview
Yeah.
or something. Like, it's just one step in the process. Is that accurate?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. Like you wouldn't necessarily see an asynchronous interview for like the very last stage of an interview process. Like that wouldn't, I haven't really seen that as the case. I don't want to say never, but it's like you said, it's kind of some people say it replaces the phone screening process. So human resources manager might call someone up and ask them just a couple questions, make sure they're human, go through their resume a bit. It really could kind of eliminate that role because it's doing the same thing. It's asking someone to speak about their skills and abilities, but we're not bringing them in person yet. Kind of want to see if it's worth our time to bring them in person, set that meeting up synchronously, that kind of thing.
So your video channel, where do you hope to go with this? Do you hope that this will grow into something bigger? You're going on Reddit, you're actually answering people's questions, you're specifically helping people who have issues and difficulties with this. Do you figure that you'll be continuing to do that as you complete your PhD and move forward?
Yeah, I really would like to keep moving forward with the YouTube channel. I don't know where it's going to go. I think it's been just a really great opportunity to take what I've learned, especially from my master's, and apply this to the real world. And I don't see why I need to stop. Like especially because I'm not seeing a lot of specific AVI help from maybe AVI researchers. Like sometimes you see video interview help, but I feel like it's quite broad. And so it's kind of a little bit of a niche in there of, okay, what are some of the research articles that are coming out all the time? And then taking that to the people, I like to say. So yeah, I would like to keep growing it. I don't know if I'll branch out into maybe a different part of interviews outside of AVIs, let's say, but yeah, the future is bright, shall we say.
Well, and that's interesting, right? I mean, you're talking about how much science there is, and certainly in IO psychology, there's a ton of science always being done about, interview processes or workplace dynamics or, what have you, everything to do with the workplace. And you seem to be very focused and interested on translating that for the people who it's designed to help in the first place. And I think that's sometimes where a gap happens. Can you just tell me a little bit about how you think about that process and about that gap? Because so often research happens and then you find something from, 15 years ago where you say, well, that really could have been helpful if we'd been doing stuff with it up until this point.
Yeah, yeah. And it's such a tough kind of bridge to divide that I really do think across academia as a whole that people are realizing that, oh, this is so valuable. So, I see more and more podcasts, even podcasts like this, where just having that opportunity to speak about something is becoming more common. And I think, yeah, as we have different platforms that are more easily available, that helps too. And so, for example, like it's maybe 10 years ago, the idea of filming on a topic that's specifically like research based would be unheard of. Now it's easy, it's more common, so maybe people are more likely to do it. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that it is hard, and you are putting yourself out there, and especially if maybe like your skill set is more research based and you kind of enjoy like the writing side of things, like speaking about something is a different skill set. But at the same time, it's like there are other ways too that we can get this work out there. And so I see more outlets to, or even like LinkedIn posts where people, and I love this so much, people will take their research article that they've just gotten published and basically take the key findings, key summaries, make it a LinkedIn post. And it's so valuable, even for other researchers, to see what's been going on.
Yeah, I love that too. And I love that LinkedIn's become the place for that, where you can sort of distill something down to an accessible, no regular person is going to read an article in the Canadian Journal of Experimental Psychology and understand it. I can't read one of those articles and understand them. So I'm very appreciative for people who can distill them down into something bite-sized and understandable. Mm-hmm. So last question then. Yeah. What is, somebody's listening to this right now, they're going to go do an AVI in a couple of days. They've got to put this together. What's your number one piece of advice to people who are about to go through that process?
I think practicing your answers out loud is really important. That's a lot different from practicing in your head. When we say something out loud, it helps us process it. Does it sound right? Does it sound off? And with that as well, you might not know how long you have to respond. So answering a question in 30 seconds is different than 2 minutes versus 5 minutes. And so if you out loud different response lengths, that's really helpful for when the timer comes up, you see it counting down, okay, this is what I've practiced out loud, it'll feel familiar, and this is how long I have, so I kind of know how much I can squeeze in.
I think that's excellent advice. I worked in radio for many years, and in doing that, I realized just how difficult it is for most people to comprehend. I have 1 minute to speak, and for some people that's an eternity, and for some people they're just starting to get into the thing that they were trying to talk about when the timer hits and it ends, right? So I think that's extremely good advice.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
And thanks to you at home for listening, streaming, downloading, and tuning in to February Psychology Month on the Mindful podcast. Check out Madeline's YouTube channel and research in the show notes, and please share it with anyone you know who has to do a one-way video for a job interview. This episode was written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our producer and editor is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.